Welcome to Chapter 4, AP U.S. History Syllabus Questions. American Life in the 17th Century. The first one reads, describe the basic population structure and social life of the 17th century colonist. Okay, a lot of the social stuff is in the textbook, and a lot of this I think is also answered in some of the other questions. So basically all of the below put together. Read the first paragraph, pay attention to the next chapter as well. Anyway, this is one thing I do like to show though, the Southern Society Triangle. Now this is how society was broken down in the South. Again, we tend to think that colonists were, black hat, they look like a Quaker, or the guy in the Quaker box, a Puritan, the very strict and religious. Not how it was in the South. They were all settled for different reasons, and Southern colonists became very aristocratic. And so we had the top, it's kind of like a pyramid, and at the very top, these people, aristocrats, the leading planters, the people who owned definitely hundreds of acres of land, very wealthy merchants, lawyers, clergymen, I know it's kind of weird, and officials. These are the very top of the social food chain, and they controlled vast majority of the government. They owned the vast majority of land, and yet they were by far the smallest amount in the South. Then you had this group, professional men, who just probably weren't as wealthy as these guys. Then look at the biggest percentage of the population. This word is yeoman, which just means farmer, kind of small farmer. So they were like small landowning farmers, maybe just a few acres, and they might have owned no slaves, or they might have owned a handful of slaves. The vast majority of slaves were owned by a very few amount of people, probably something that you were not aware of. Then you had these people who probably owned no land, owned no slaves, and they were considered low class. And then you had this group. This is a funny word, jailbirds. This is from the textbook. Indentured servants. I mean, these were some low-life whites right down here. But below them, of course, building the foundation, were slaves. So this is the Southern Triangle, Southern Society Triangle. So hopefully you all listen to this and you're aware of this. This is not how it was in New England, and not how it was for the most part of the middle colonies. Okay, 2. Compare and contrast the different population and ways of life in Southern colonies and New England. Extremely different from each other. Okay, the Southern colonies were warmer, swampier. Diseases thrived there. In New England, it was cold, but they were healthier because many viruses and bacteria don't live in such cold climates. Because of this, one of the reasons, they were slow to grow. They had to have fresh immigrants because they were dying off. New England, they may have been cold all the time, but they didn't die from diseases. They had greater growth because of the Great Migration of the 1630s of the Puritans. Very fragile families because everybody died off. Women had more rights. There were no grandparents in general. Obviously, there could have been some, but I mean, people just didn't live that long. And because there was kind of like a lax of family structure, especially down in these groups, down in here, surprisingly, there was higher teen pregnancy. Now, they got married, but anyway, that's in your book. You can read about it. So because they lived longer, they had solid families. They supposedly invented grandparents. Now, they had difficult soil, so plantation farming wasn't going to last there. They had fishing, lumber, all this kind of stuff. The mountains and the soil kept them all geographically close together, so they had all these little small cute towns. Not really cute, they were really pretty nasty. Very democratic for the most part. Town meetings, the seeds of democracy and eventually revolution are sown in these areas. Compare it to the southern colonies. Tobacco exhausted the land. Tobacco was very labor intensive, so they needed a lot of indentured servants. Tobacco was, though, still easier slave life than rice and indigo that was grown in the deep south. And so this is what everybody focused on. All the way up, these people owned all the land, and that was it. Farming, as you saw in your worksheets, was the main thing. There's something called the headright system, where these landowners were given 50 acres and some other stuff for if they brought over indentured servants. So none of this stuff existed over here, and simply because of climate and geography didn't allow it. Bacon's Rebellion, I think I discussed later on down here, yes. So they're going to have a rebellion that makes southern landowners look to slaves. So now in New England colonies, there were slaves in the beginning. It just wasn't economical. There was no need to have, millions, because there weren't plantations. So there's no point in it. So there was, at least theoretically, greater equality. I mean, there's still the more churchier ones thought that they were better. In New York, you still had the aristocrats, but for the most part, that was a middle colony. For the most part, equality was much more abound in New England. The social gaps in the southern colonies were way wider in New England than in New England. Like I showed you on the triangle, the top, they had that pyramid. People were much more similar. They didn't have the gentry or the aristocratic people like we saw on the top of the triangle. English immigration over many decades, English gentry, sugar planters from the Indies, lowly indentured servants. The top of the triangle, upper crust controlled the House of Burgesses, which was the first form of government in Virginia. So this is just showing there were lots of different kinds of groups that came over here, where mostly it was Puritans of kind of the same stage in society when they left England. Slavery was never profitable. It's not that they were nicer, it just wasn't profitable. In some areas, entire towns transplanted over here, and a new town kind of instantly sprang up. Kind of more socialism, sort of everybody worked together. They didn't call it that, but that's, the holy city upon a hill is what they wanted to create. Education was very important. In order to read the Bible, you had to learn to read. So they had a mandatory school broken up in many of the towns. They had to have them. Now, compare that to in the South, life just revolved around plantations and the planter class. Cities were very slow to emerge, and there aren't nearly the number as what there will become in New England. The idea of teaching everyone, no way did these people care about the education of anybody else. So it was very different, and you can see it. The first college was in Harvard, 1636, and the first college in the southern colonies was the College of William and Mary, 1693. So that right there shows you, and way more colleges are built up here, Dartmouth, Princeton, all of those, than in the southern colonies in the beginning. So education was important to them as a group. That's it for 1 and 2.